All right. Well, good late morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. We're Steve Vinci and Jamie Mackay with GluMac, both over 25 years, focused just on building envelope, building enclosures, both on the consulting side, commissioning. We've lectured on the topic, we've written articles, taught on everything, so very in-depth and really focused just on sort of that building enclosure thing. And today we're going to talk to you sort of from looking at building retrofits, things like that, the most kind of overlooked part of those. Primarily those are like chiller replacements, HVAC replacements, things like that. But, a lot of the times, unless something's drastically wrong with maybe the roof, the building enclosure kind of gets overlooked with a lot of these retrofit projects. So just some of the housekeeping items about checking in and get your CEUs. All this stuff, some of the learning objectives. So as we get into it, looking at what our task at hand is, where the industry's going, we'll have some examples of what the data is sort of telling us from that historical perspective, and as we move forward, the present and even future as codes progress, and then going through some examples and some strategies from some case studies. Turn over to Jamie.
Yeah, for sure. And at any time, just raise your hand if you want to stop on something. We can kind of go into more detail on it. But we've got a full deck essentially coming up. So I think it's always important really to start with the idea of context, right? Is that we're looking at, mostly here, we're talking about the commercial, institutional, kind of large building stocks. And of course, there are so many of them within the United States, but they're all kind of concentrated in the big cities. So I think it's really important really kind of just to pay attention to where buildings are and why we pay attention to buildings by themselves. Buildings are an enormous value. I mean, this is essentially, if you start thinking about where all of our businesses come through, where we make our money, where the GDP comes, all this stuff basically comes within these buildings, and that's the value that we're trying to essentially protect. So a building that's not working well, where people aren't working well, that's money that's basically going out the door. So constantly discussing this idea about why. Why do we care about large buildings? Why do we want to make sure that buildings essentially stay, operational and people basically in them themselves? I think the other thing too is that we're going to start to talk a little bit about some of the sweet spots when we look at existing buildings. And if you look at it, almost 75% of the buildings were built before 2000. Right, so there's a huge chunk of about 54% of buildings, existing commercial buildings right now, that really fit within that 1960 to basically the year 2000. And that's really an interesting sweet spot. And those who are probably doing retrofit buildings, it's probably this stock of buildings that you're really kind of paying attention to right now. The interesting thing about buildings too is that they're getting bigger, right? As we see, bigger, more complex. There's more pressure on them. From an enclosure perspective, we say that's higher kind of exposure and bigger issues that start to come down the line. I think other things, again, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but this is where the energy kind of profile sits, is that about 34% of the energy goes into buildings. As we look at sort of a national, where is our energy used? You've seen these numbers, I'm sure, before. But again, why the context is looking at these buildings themselves. And so I think a lot of the work that we're probably doing in the industry is this idea of trying to, minimize that energy use, make sure that there's less pressure essentially on our grid, trying to adapt our existing buildings. And this is really where we want to pay attention to, and we really want to focus in on the enclosure specifically. And I think to be able to sort of meet and to assist our grids, because our grids are very vulnerable, we're putting in more and more power stations every year. I think I was reading another study, there's 160 new power stations basically coming on this year, really kind of to meet our demand. And those who are in the sort of the data industry and looking at data centers, I mean, there's enormous number of data centers that are basically coming on board just to sort of feed that need that we have with AI and everything else. So we really need to sort of minimize that energy use in the buildings themselves. And if we're looking only at new construction buildings, we're never going to be able to meet that. So this idea really is that we need to retrofit existing buildings. We really need to kind of focus on that. But there are a lot of barriers when we start talking about enclosures. Some of them are knowledge. Some people are like, well, what happens if? What happens if I do something to that enclosure and mess it up, right? There used to be all that discussion about, oh, I'll spray foam the inside of brick and then the brick falls apart. And it's like, I don't want to touch it, right? I don't know enough about it. Or it's disturbance to occupants, or it's, just, hey, I'm a mechanical firm. I know how to do mechanical. I'll fix the mechanical or the lighting or those types of things. So really what we're trying to get into is that the knowledge is out there. We know how to basically model these things. We know how to get the investigation behind it. We know how to kind of tackle these. And there's some really good strategies, and we'll go through a few of them that really help to offset some of that mechanical that you're already planning on doing. Steve will kind of walk us through a bit of that kind of difference between, existing, new construction and existing buildings.
So when we're talking about sort of the higher performing buildings, from a new construction perspective, it's a pretty linear process from that design perspective, right? You work with your design team, you look at sort of the massing, right? What your exposure is on the site, your form of the building, right? Once you get that down, you start looking at the envelope, right? You're trying to make sort of, we call it like the lowest energy box, right? You're looking at efficiencies you can have with the envelope. Then with those, you start looking at those, systems, how to condition, light, heat, cool those spaces, right? And looking at the controls, how you're going to control sequencing, things like that. And maybe you start revisiting things, trying to look for some of the synergies, some of the trade-offs, right? Is there a performance improvement in the envelope that could drastically help, from an MEP side? Like, are you reducing your loads enough that you can have smaller systems there? Are you looking at using, all heat pumps in a colder climate? So it's putting a lot more effort on the envelope to be more thermally efficient for some of these heat pump things to work like that. So it's kind of a simplified process, and it's, goes in a quite straight line. We've seen a lot of these things, how, design teams put these things together about where the synergies come through, looking at it from that whole building perspective, right? With those passive strategies, lighting, do we need enough lighting? If we have enough day lighting, right? Natural light, clear stories, things like that. So there's a lot of these things out there that we've obviously probably seen a lot of.
Yeah, I was going to add to that as well. It's like, I think enclosures has always been sort of like tied to architecture, and a lot of things that we've been talking a lot about is sort of taking that aesthetic away from the architecture side and looking at essentially where everything happens. The enclosure really is sometimes part of, but a lot of times behind that sort of aesthetic side of it. And really the way we look at it, and now because we're with like a mechanical firm, is we're saying this is a passive system. The enclosure is a passive system. It's doing all the same things that mechanical active systems are doing. It's just doing it in a passive way. So redefining the enclosure really as another system really helps us really discuss that whole thing about commissioning itself, is how do we understand each of the components then and how they're supposed to act.
Yeah. And from an existing building perspective, it's not such a linear process. It's a moving target, right? It depends on the complexity of the building, depends on what the budget and what the goals are of the owner. Sometimes, you don't need to, we're not up here preaching like you need to reskin your building or redo the envelope every few years to get that efficiency. Sometimes, when you're doing a roof replacement, improving, the R value of that roof can really move that needle from that energy perspective, replacing windows, things like that. So, your thought process from an existing building's perspective, it has to be flexible, right? It's not very, prescriptively sitting there. So, each existing building, we always say it's more project specific. There's not sort of prescriptive requirements that you take from each project going down, right? Unless you have a client that has multiple buildings, that's just like a cookie cutter building and they're going to do the same thing to all buildings. Maybe you can look at it from a prescriptive perspective, but each of those buildings are probably in a different climate zone. So everything is looked at sort of from that whole building perspective, right? Cost, acceptance of risk, how these systems are going to be maintained, things like that. And those project specific approaches, if you have a low energy goal or resilience target, right? There's not one item, when you're looking at all your different choices, there's not one path, right? You have multiple paths to get to that goal. There's different decisions you can make that have synergies with other things, and you can get to that goal based on, a mix and match of sort of your different progress and decisions.
Mm-hmm. And that's a parametric modeling. So this is basically running like 50,000 models at one time. trying to figure out essentially what's the best path, like how do we do this? And these are really fun kind of models to set up at very early charrettes with owners to sort of talk about like what are all our systems, what are, how do we confine, how do we set these elements? And as Steve was saying, is that there's multiple different ways. So as we start to like say, okay, well, what's our window to wall ratio, or what are we, we using heat pumps, or, what's our, are we using ERVs on this? Like we can start to dial in and say, okay, if that's what you're doing, then this is kind of a couple of different options on the enclosure side of it. And we play with things like air leakage and saying, well, if we can get our air leakage down to, under 0.25, then what does this now do to other elements of it? So interactive tools like this and database design is becoming, obviously, like you guys are all used to this as well, but it's another tool to be able to discuss how do we go about it.
And so where the industry is going, we see a lot of these things, this is the existing building benchmarking. A lot of cities or states have these building performance standards, right? And each iteration of that standard as it gets updated, the existing buildings have to keep meeting those energy targets. We're seeing some owners and places that are proactive and, as they're designing new, planning for future performance requirements so they don't have to start paying those fines. You will have owners that think like, I want bare minimum and, we'll accept paying those fines over the next, 3 or 4 iterations of that code before we need to start thinking about actually improving the building. So there's things like the, building performance standards that's driving things out there. A lot of places start having these facade ordinances, right? So there's a lot more increased requirements and rules related to existing facade or enclosure inspections for like public safety, right? Like you hear about, panels falling off a building, things like that. So there's a lot of these ordinances where they start paying a lot of fines. So this is outside of that sort of energy realm of, performance perspective. It's sort of like just another case where if you just leave the enclosure untouched, there could be some repercussions. LEED version 5 that, started on Monday for registration for the existing buildings, the O&M, the building envelope plays a key part for the project resilience. There's a lot of these things now that are sort of a prerequisite on doing your sort of resiliency planning. So looking at, areas of wildfire, flooding, things like that. So the envelope starts to play a big role as you start looking at your existing building stock from that resiliency perspective. And then, they're looking at sort of that peak load management, right? Becoming good grid citizens. So they're looking at improving both, the air leakage performance of existing buildings and even, where possible, looking at, improving thermal bridging, right? And so a lot of these things, it doesn't apply to every project. If you have some existing building projects where they're not really doing much to the envelope, obviously you're not going after a lot of these credits, but there's, showing some of the industry, leads trying to push this improvement perspective related to the building envelope. ASHRAE 227P, so this is a building design standard. This is both for new and existing buildings. So it's starting to look and starting to have people think about your existing building stock to come into like that passive survivability, right? Like how can you improve the envelope to be a lot more resilient from, in the case of power outages, things like that. That brings us into sort of PHIUS, or the Passive House Institute of the US. They have this Revive retrofit standard for buildings. So this is one of the biggest ones where they're actually looking at you maintaining habitable conditions, comfortable conditions in the absence of power, right? So again, pushing that passive survivability further and further. And so, part of it is, accounting for all thermal bridges. Usually the old way of looking at things is sort of like, hey, I've got this building, I put R20 bats in the wall, it's an R20 wall. Well, it's like, not really. If you start accounting for all your thermal bridges, all those studs, all the inside, outside corners, your window to wall transition, right? You start accounting for all the lineal and point thermal bridges, all of a sudden, what people used to think is an R20 wall becomes an R4 wall, right? So they're starting to look at coming up with the true effective R value for these buildings that would play back into sort of like how mechanical systems are operated and even designed. And a lot of these things, we start talking about these improvements on the building enclosure. It's kind of like this little hidden treat, right? It's like the old toy that used to be in your box of cereal. It's kind of like these energy improvements in performance, like air tightness, things like that, leads to adding resiliency to your project. So this is a graph. So in the state of Massachusetts, for residential projects now, you have to do passive house or low TEDI. And so low TEDI, what that is, it's your low like thermal energy demand intensity. So it's basically like take an EUI, but it's for your thermal barrier, right? So it's for the building envelope, and it relates to sort of like air leakage and thermal bridging. So this is an example from Massachusetts where, they did some modeling with sort of that absence of power, and you can see in the wintertime, the temperature starts to drop below 50 degrees. So, could people stay in these apartment buildings if there's a big storm that took out the power grid, right? People are going to get displaced, or could they stay in their homes, right? So, this is an example from like cold climate. So if you're in, some of these warm climate areas, the inverse could happen too, right? Absence of power, you could have big spikes if you don't have energy in there to cool the building. So, a lot of the times maybe people don't have the backup power to have air conditioning systems running on in the absence of power. But, some of these areas, if you're looking at your envelope, you could add a bit of that resilience to some of these buildings. And this one is more related to, this is sort of the forest fire map across the US. We're seeing a lot more people displaced from fire risk. But one other thing that's not really talked about is people actually get displaced from the air quality. So maybe there's a forest fire near you, but you're not in imminent danger, but the air quality outside doesn't allow you to go into the office, be in an apartment building, things like that. So we've seen some studies from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory where they looked at sort of this resiliency perspective from an air leakage in your building, and sort of, a lot of places across the country, code for building envelope air leakage is that 0.4 CFM per square foot, right? So they looked at that, and if you meet that with some, improved filtration in your HVAC system, you could probably get about, 50 to 30% difference from the outside air quality to the inside. But if you improve that to sort of the 0.25, sort of that Army Corps of Engineers, that 0.25 to 0.2 range, you can reduce that to under 5% with good filtration, right? So there again, you can have people that even though the wind's blowing a certain way, you have bad, outdoor air quality. Just think of like schools, for instance, things like that. Like kids could still be in their classrooms, not stuck at home, breathing in this air. And sort of the little chart below is a project we actually did at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and they had their code, their goal set at 0.4, and with minimal changes, was basically using the building enclosure assemblies and materials they had. We just improved on a few of the details, and we actually got it down to 0.2 for the air leakage, right? So we basically beat their target by 100%, right? So there's a bit of benefit from the HVAC systems and things like that, but in that area of California, they're always under threat of forest fire as well as the outdoor air quality.
Thanks, Steve. So I think what we're going to do here is we're going to take a little bit a look at some of the data and what the data is showing us itself. So one of the things with from an enclosure perspective is really trying to figure out like what is a building telling us, right? And this is part historian, part researcher, part building listener, like, trying to really kind of look at a building and say, tell me essentially about what's going on with it. Because, I'm doing projects that, like, remember I told you about that sweet spot of sort of like 1960s, 70s to 2000. Do you have great drawings? Does everybody like have all of the facility sort of management stuff? Like, is there all the documents available? In most cases, no. It's like a little bits and pieces. So you're trying to take a look at a building and say, okay, well, how do I predict this? How do I look at it, right? So one of the things that we do is from, if we only look at the energy side of it, and we'll just focus on these two elements, really it's just the windows and walls on U value and R value, and that of air leakage. Not that the other things aren't important, right? Moisture is definitely important. Vapor in certain places is important, but these are the big areas that are really going to focus in when we talk about sort of that energy conservation. Now, there's a lot going on with this graph, but I'm sure most people are used to seeing this as basically the sort of evolution of 90.1, when it kind of came in and basically where it's going. And this is essentially pointing as far down as we can go to get to net zero by 2030, 2050, depending on what you look at. But there's a huge difference when we kind of look at pre sort of that 2004 and post 2004. There's probably a 50% difference essentially in that energy profile as kind of defined by 90.1. And the sort of two kind of lines that are going up and off to the side are existing buildings, right? So these are existing buildings that sort of started pre these dates, in that kind of 60s, 70s timeframe. And really they're getting worse, right? They don't stagnate, they basically get worse. So that delta between our new construction and our existing buildings is just growing and growing every single year. So really that importance of trying to figure out, and this is why I'm sort of targeting this idea of somewhere in that 1970s to 2000s, those are the great ones, right? Those are the ones that I think we can have the biggest impact on. When we look at codes, and I just basically grabbed this one for North Carolina, is that we know that we are not, like every time there's a new code out, we don't suddenly jump on and there we are, right? I mean, these things stay for like 5 years, 7 years, sometimes like that. And there's a huge difference between where we're at now from a new construction perspective, best code, whatever's out, compared to essentially what we're building in a new construction perspective. So understanding where the codes are going is always important for us. Now, I did a quick sort of update on this because I think it's July 1, 2025. North Carolina switching to the 2021 IECC, which is great, because that's basically a significant jump essentially from that previous, which was the 2015, right? So code and new construction is getting better. That's great, but as we said, those existing buildings, they're still there. They're not following suit with this. So one of the things we did is we took a look at some of the existing assemblies. So trying to figure out like what did we typically build in that pre-60s? What did we typically build in 1970s, 80s, 90s? And you can find some good representative samples and use a little bit of like, ingenuity to kind of say, okay, well, let's look at that. So took that, went into sort of our thermal bridging guide that tells us like what's effective U values and started charting these things out. And really what we see and really what's going on with this graph is sort of saying between 70s and 2000, there was a little bit of an increase in U value itself. The walls got a little bit better post, 1970s oil embargo. It's like, okay, we better start paying attention to this. But it really wasn't until the 2000s we started seeing a huge increase essentially in U values and R values for new construction. So again, right, really kind of focusing on that area. When people come to me and say, well, hey, we've got a 2015 building, what do you think we can do from an enclosure perspective? It's like, well, if there's something wrong, we can do some retro commissioning and I think we could probably fix it. But that's not the sweet spot, right? Yes, there's always something that we can do. But if someone comes to me and says, hey, I've got a 1975 building, which is like, happens to be, I think, the same age as, as the hotel we're in, it's like, okay, now I think there's something we can kind of play with here from an enclosure perspective. Because it's always about like, where does that money go? Where do we want to kind of like place things? So if we look at it a little bit of this is kind of like history. So as I said, you're kind of playing a little bit of detective, understanding like when did insulations kind of come in? When are we using like fiberglass and cellulose? When did foam start to come in? A lot of this information just helps us understand like what's in the walls in this building here. How do we kind of predict it? Which means then how do we go about finding the U values themselves? And of course, not all insulations are the same, right? They're not created the same. We've got some really cool new ones coming out, but they're still quite expensive as we look at like nanogels at like R10 per inch or VIP panels, vacuum insulated panels at R34 per inch. Well, that would be great. And if you wanted to come to me and say, hey, we want to do the whole thing in vacuum insulated panels, like sign me up. I'd be like all over it, but no one can pay for that right now. No, it's a great thing, and I think it's going to basically solve some issues in the future. But right now, we're still playing with mineral wools and bad insulations and foams, right? That's still essentially the ballpark that we're in. Another interesting thing too, especially on the commissioning side of it, is how is our insulation put in place? We think, okay, we put this insulation and of course we're getting, if it was an R19, we're getting R19 out of it, right? And the fact is that we're not. In most cases, we have poor installations, and we're not even getting the effectiveness out of the installation that we do put in place, regardless of even the thermal bridging side of it. So it's trying to do, and this is, I think, again, where great commissioning comes in, is that overwatch and the discussion about, how do we install installations? How do we get the most out of everything that we're putting into it? Because, just like MEP, right? If it's not done right, it's not going to work right. Window to wall ratio is always a big thing, especially if you're modelers, is we're always discussing that whole concept of window to wall ratio, kind of cranking that down to like 40 and then 30 and then 20 and passive house, trying to get those things down. So I wanted to take a little bit of a historical look at like, how have we done this in the past, right? So grabbed a couple of buildings basically around town here. And the fact of the matter is that we've always built with lots of glass. Okay, maybe not all glass like we're doing now, but there's still been a fair amount of glass that we've used in our buildings. And the number one problem with buildings from a thermal perspective is glass. Now, architects like to build, boxes with glass in it because, it makes people be able to connect to the outside and have daylighting. And absolutely, we definitely need that. But we need to understand essentially that relationship. And those windows are one of the keys to sort of unlocking what we can do from an enclosure perspective. Window performance has changed significantly. So, we're looking at single pane windows, which is basically in this building here, to really cranking them down to like passive house windows that are getting down to a U value of 0.18 or lower. So we're seeing a significant shift, and that again opens up opportunities for us to kind of look in the future.
And I think one thing to think about is, as Jamie's going through these things from that historical data perspective of, traditional R values when they started to improve, those date timelines, things like that, is that you may have owners and projects that, they want to do like some asset management. They want you to help them sort of predict like what is actually the performance of these things, because maybe we'll do a renewal or a remodel down the road. And sometimes, these initial assessment times don't allow for people to come in and start doing, test openings. Like we can't go up and start, displacing people in their offices to start cutting holes in the wall to actually confirm, like, is there insulation in here? What type is it? To confirm that, right? So a lot of this sort of forensic, historical look will give you like a peace of mind, like, okay, your building was built in this timeline. You're probably sitting at this value for your R values for your walls, and your windows are roughly going to be around this area, right? So it gives you a bit more of a, an engineered sort of guess, right? You're not just like picking something out of the wall, like what was code that day. You're looking at it like what's the vintage of the building and what's actually realistic.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. And the idea too, again, between like ASHRAE level 2 audits, or if we're doing energy modeling, is that we are always using brackets. We're sort of saying, okay, well, it should be somewhere between here and here. And let's look at like the sensitivity analysis in modeling to sort of say, well, if it's R4 to 6, it's like, yeah, fine. That's a fine ballpark. It has to get to like R15 until it suddenly like trips something else. So that gives us some flexibility to understand like where we are. This is like vacuum insulated glass that's basically coming along. And again, like really high performance. This is not even getting into like clear PVs, which is another thing that's basically coming into the future. But these are opportunities that we're going to start to see, especially as we try to electrify our existing enclosures as well, to basically be able to use that for more power generation. From an air leakage perspective, it is like a scatter. It is all over the place. When you look at sort of those so the bottom sort of left graph, if you look at that number before 2000, it is all over the map. And it's true. This is what we find, is that when we go to do, whole building air leakage tests, if we have the ability to do it, we find that air leakage is all over the map. But what happened post 2000 is you just started seeing it drop significantly. And so these are metric numbers on it, and they're converted sort of on the side. But you can see sort of where that 1 CFM per square foot is, how many are above that. And as we get down to basically less than 0.1 CFM per square foot. The graph on the right-hand side is talking about different types of buildings. And what you find is in these sort of stick-framed type buildings, that's where you have the largest sort of variance. You still have some that are performing really well, but you have a lot that basically aren't. And we did a couple of studies, like ourselves and a couple of other consultants, basically in the Washington State area, because it's really been pushing air leakage for quite some time. We took a look and said, well, what kind of air barriers actually make sense, right? And again, what we found is that almost all the air barriers can work. The sheet applied membranes, sheet applied air barriers are a little bit more variant. So it's those of your Tyvek and your papers and et cetera. Those ones have to have a lot more detailing in it, but you can get down to those kind of numbers. So anyone who says, oh, it has to be, it's like, no, that's not true, right? So proper detailing, proper attachments, proper coordination, you can basically get down to these numbers. And then last one, I just thought I'd throw this in because I was kind of reading up on some stuff on moisture management and rain screens. And rain screens really didn't come down to the States. I'm from Canada, but rain screens didn't come down to the States and sort of into the 2000s again. And so here again is that number that we keep seeing about that 2000 kind of mark. So before that, we had what we call face seal, where basically water, hopefully it doesn't get past the outside skin. If it gets past the outside skin, it's in, and that's a problem. And so rain screens has become kind of like a common thing that we see now. Curtain walls kind of use a rain screen approach. Claddings mostly are now using that rain screen approach. And then I also wanted to sort of take a look again at this idea between a 70s buildings, a 90s building, and a today building from a thermographic perspective. Because thermography is yet another one of those things that we can use that if you can't get inside the building, you can sort of say, okay, well, what information can I gather from that? So this is the University of Washington. This is basically near my neighborhood. Went out one evening. It was a perfect night, no wind, nice and cool. No rain, which is tough for Seattle. Went out there and basically said, okay, well, let's go take a look at it. So 1970s buildings, single pane windows, concrete, with interior insulation. And what you're seeing here is the light, it's basically blown up on where the glass. The glass is essentially what you would expect to see. It's the worst performing element of it. The yellow that's sort of surrounding it, a lot of air leakage, a lot of sort of thermal loss around it. So I was like, okay, that's kind of what I was expecting to see. Get to a 1990s buildings, you now have like double pane glass in there. The glass is performing a little bit better, but those transitions not working super well. Now there might be also moisture in this, but I think a lot of this is also sort of showing us that continuous air barrier side of it, really not something that was done at that time.
And if you just looked at both ones, that first one where the windows are just glowing red, right? And you go to the other one that's, late 90s building. If you look at that previous building perspective, I bet you if you went through and just replaced like the glass on that to like, a today code double pane thing, like that'll move that needle a lot from that energy perspective for that owner, right? Windows have to get replaced at some point, so replacing them with something better, like that's just one little thing that would have to be part of their renewals planning anyway, but that would be a great benefit from that energy perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was the same building. This is a new building on campus. The numbers are a little bit different just basically in the metrics, but what you're seeing again is focus on the windows. Basically, most of the walls are showing really no thermal losses. There's one big glare in the middle, and I knew the consultant who worked on the architect, and I said, whoa, what's going on here? And they're like, don't worry about that. That was it's a gas, basically gives gas release on an exhaust system. And I said, okay, well, good, because man, that thing looked weird, right? But it was neat to be able to see, okay, well, that's what's happening. And then, the Bullitt Center was kind of like, the greenest building ever built kind of thing back in 2013. And this is all insulated metal panels. Insulated metal panels work really well. I mean, there's not a lot of thermal bridging in the middle of the panels. That's what we're sort of seeing on the IR images to the right. Windows are basically lighting up a bit, a little bit of loss essentially around some of those transitions, what we see. So again, that's 2013. I think we could even improve essentially on those. But it's another one of those pieces of toolkits that we're able to kind of use to say, okay, well, what is this building telling me? How do I get that information from it? Where do we focus? Because when I work with our MEP folks, they're like, okay, tell me why we should do something to this enclosure. Tell me why we should spend money on that, and what are the EEMs, right? Those energy conservation or energy efficiency measures. Like, tell me what's going to work on this one. And so we'll take it from there, and we'll go into a few kind of like case studies. You want to handle these, or you want? I can do the first one. So this is kind of a really fun one that I've seen a lot now happening. We've talked a lot about it, and this is putting a high performance. This is using that concept of like storm windows, but basically putting them on the inside. So you're using a high performance glazing on the inside of an existing single pane. So heritage windows, this is perfect, right? Can't touch that window because it's a heritage area. We can still get high performance, right? I've done this for consulates. We've done this for museums, like really, really good strategy. There's definitely some technical stuff you have to work out. but a great way to do it. And it's, relatively low cost because you can, basically bring everything in through the interior, relatively low impact on occupants because you can kind of do it, window by window, space by space. So a really good strategy to be able to do that. This is another one that.
Yeah, this is just, this is an example of a, existing building. They're replacing the windows anyway. It was exterior insulated, metal stud, so metal frame building. They had existing, aluminum storefront just installed in the metal framed rough opening. So we just looked at, like, when we're doing the window replacement, how can we improve on this? And we found doing some thermal modeling, just lining that rough opening with a little bit of wood, right, to break that, two highly conductive materials from touching each other to break up that thermal bridge. Whole building wise, there was a 13% improvement. Just putting, you're replacing the window anyway, just lining that with a little bit of wood, drastically improve that from that thermal perspective.
Yeah, and I think if we go back to that 1970s building that we saw where it was basically showing the yellow all the way around the windows, that's showing that air leakage. So addressing the window and then the window wall connection, just like here, would actually see, it's a twofer, right? You basically get two things basically from one kind of approach. This is another one that basically is coming out of Europe, and it's been around for a while, but I don't really see it done all that much. This is the idea of basically coming to a poorly performing building itself, pre-manufacturing walls and roofs, coming and attaching it. So overclad would be kind of like another kind of approach to this. I like this because it basically is bringing in all the modular walls that we're seeing in modular roofing. You're basically leaving everything in place and then attaching a new high-performance wall or roof right to the building. So there are specific examples that this would work really well for, and others that, of course, there wouldn't. I mean, obviously, this is a heritage building. There's no way you're going to be able to do something like this. But that's the thing about strategies, is that there's ones that fit and there's ones that don't, and that's okay. You need a list. You need to be able to go through it and make sure that you're picking the right one.
Yeah, and then like New York City is a great example for some of these sort of case studies of from a retrofit perspective. There's the retrofit playbook for large buildings. So these are ones, this is the heritage. This owner really wanted to basically had some low carbon targets, increase resilience, but then also update the look. So this is kind of like that extreme case example where, they basically did like a full EIFS, so exterior insulated finish system, like overclad, panelized wall system with some new high performance windows. So basically this is kind of like that reskinning of the building, right? Like this is somebody that had deep pockets. They had some really big goals they wanted to, and they wanted to basically update the look to match, some of the newer buildings in the surrounding to attract, a lot of tenants and people to come in there. Basically with their, their compliance, they have to look at improving the costs and also the building performance standards. The reclad, is estimated to avoid about $10 million in compliance costs between now and 2046. So sometimes, that ROI calculation isn't sort of like, what's the energy improvement and like how many kilowatt hours am I going to say, like looking at it from your, utility bill perspective. It's looking at some of these other unforeseen costs for maybe maintenance, penalties and things like that. Another one too, you go to any city across the US, you've probably seen an apartment building that looks exactly like this. This one's in the Bronx. And basically this is one where they looked at some HVAC improvements, but then this one, they just went through and replaced windows, right? They didn't do a full reclad. They didn't do many other things. And you can kind of see on that graph, that big steep drop is like when they replaced the windows, right? They had some single pane, very poor performing, metal framed windows, and they just updated them to sort of like, a today's standard window. And they saw that much drastic improvement from an energy perspective. And then, so as we start looking through things like this, this is sort of a tip we grabbed. This is just a typical, tower. This is in Miami, Florida. So southern climate, and you start looking at like, when it comes time to do something to this building, what are the opportunities, right? Aside from, MEP upgrades that could happen here, when I look at this, I'm sure that, elevation probably has a very beautiful view. There looks like there's nothing obstructing the view, but every blind is pulled down, right? So it's kind of like, what kind of glass is in those windows? And maybe as you start looking for the next sort of, update if they're going to do any renovations to this building, maybe it's looking at better performing glass, right? I'm sure, they're not pulling that down just for glare. It's probably for heat too. So like, could you get a better performing window? Could you get one with a better like solar heat gain coefficient, for instance, right? So like some of these things you start looking at, and here's some probably low hanging fruit that could happen. The other side of this, looking at sort of that northern climate, cold, dry. This is a building, it's a tower in downtown Toronto. So this was built in, 1975. They had the big marble panels. I'm sure you've seen a lot of these buildings that either have the precast, like concrete, marble, granite panels. They have a city ordinance there, so they're paying a lot of money from a maintenance perspective and doing yearly reviews for that public safety, aspect as well. So in about 2007, they had like a lot of, harsh winter conditions. Some of that freeze-thaw cycle, it broke some of the panels, and some of those granite panels fell through that roof of that lower building there. So, they started to look at like, how can we upgrade this building to make it more modern, low energy performance, things like that. So they took off, over the course of 3 years, they took off all the granite panels. They came back with a higher performing window. They came back with a panel system that has basically like a ceramic frit, so it looks to be the same as the marble, but a lot more higher perform. They're able to add in, because it's a lighter panel, more insulation to that, right? So they're not doing structural upgrades because the building was just holding big giant marble panels. So they're able to improve on this aspect. But this is kind of like one of those areas where, this client did have deep pockets and wanted to deal with it. But again, like that ROI, they're saving millions of dollars from having somebody doing the maintenance on those old marble panels for those city ordinances.
And this is to sort of make sure that you were paying attention. So this is basically back to you now. So here we are in this building itself. What do we know about this building? What can we sort of like derive? I've already sort of told you some of the elements of it. Climate hazards here, high heat, big basically rains, power outages essentially there. So you guys are now the consultants. What are we going to do, right? What's the idea behind these buildings? What are we going to do to make sure that we get the resilience and performance out of this existing building? We're your clients now. Tell us why and what are we going to do? Anybody? Come on.
We're going to look at the windows.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So if someone was paying attention halfway through, nice. So what are we going to do with these windows, right? What kind of windows do we have?
They're single pane or?
There we go. Yeah. So, when I come into my room, I open up the drapes. I basically look down because I wanted to see if there was a stamp in the IGU. There's no IGU. It's a single pane. Okay. Right. So right off the bat, I'm like, this is me, right? You guys maybe look up at this stuff. I don't look at that. Unless there's stains. I go look at the walls and basically touch everything. I'm like, damn, that's hot. Ooh, this is like, what's going on here? So non-thermally broken, single panes, water ingress at all the joints, right? We got some problems with the windows. So what would we do with these windows? You can answer, or anybody else if they want. Yeah, you're passing it on.
North Carolina. Sorry, you definitely need low E coating because the solar heat gain is enormous in North Carolina, and air sealing of the frames is a huge priority because that wasn't done in North Carolina up until 5 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah. So our low E is going to help us essentially with our thermal, and then solar heat gains are going to be like coatings or et cetera within the. But you're right. So trying to get that heat to stay out, but then also low E is going to help us keep that cool in when we're cooling things down. And then again, you're right. Absolutely, it's that air leakage around it. If we did a thermal scan on this, I think the same thing. It was light up. You'd see that big red glare essentially for the windows, and you'd see that yellow kind of all the way around it. Okay, so we've addressed that. So did anybody know did anyone pay attention to what kind of walls we have in these buildings? Yeah, it's basically concrete. It looks like sort of a precast or some kind of concrete. So I'm going to guess, because I measured it, it's about, probably a 2x6 interior steel stud. Let's go with that, right? Let's just say that there's some bad insulation in there. Anyone want to take a guess at what nominal R value, maybe effective R value? Just throw it out there. 2x4 steel stud. Yeah, probably 10, 11, 12, some kind of in that, right? 1975, right? So I don't know where we're at, but it's definitely, probably no more than R10 nominal. Effective. So what is effective? And effective basically means accounting for all of the thermal bridging. Zero, well, maybe hopefully it's a little higher than zero, but you're probably going in the right direction, right? We're probably down somewhere in that like 4, 4 or 5 kind of thing in that range, right? Because we've got floor slabs, we've got concrete, shear walls and et cetera. So if we have an R4 wall and you guys are basically gonna go do your mechanical upgrade on this, is that something we should save? No. So what are we gonna do with those walls? How would we approach it? What's one strategy that we could use?
Spray foam it.
Yeah, so you could rip open the inside and spray foam. I think that's probably where you're going, right? And if you're going to do a tenant improvement, because hotels will typically have I think it's like a 7-year that they basically do your turnovers and your interiors. It's a little expensive, but you could go about spray foam. Can't do anything about floor slabs and all those other things, but you can get a higher performing insulation essentially in it. Well, let's say you don't want to touch that inside. What are you going to do? Yeah, so you could definitely do an exterior cladding. Is it a heritage building? I don't think so, but probably not. Maybe it is, but you could definitely do an exterior cladding on this one. Now, the nice thing about exterior cladding is you can have continuous insulation. That's basically where we're going with code anyway. You could probably improve your air leakage side of it. You could probably do a little fresh up on kind of like, the look of it. There's a lot of stuff that you could do on that. The nice thing too is you've got a concrete panel on the background. Pretty good substrate to kind of do something too. Right, so really understanding that these are different options that you can go about. You might want to tear open the inside because that's what your client's leaning towards. You might want to go to the outside. And the outside, you have lots of options of different types of insulations and et cetera. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea right behind it. But the idea here is that if we can take some of that base load down, so by improving the enclosure, then you guys from mostly, I'm going to guess that most you're doing mechanical, is you now have a much better way to sort of say, okay, now I've got something I can predict. Now I can, put this into my models and kind of pay attention to it. Now let's see what we can do from a mechanical perspective to keep these places, healthy and cool and everything else. And as Steve's pointed out before, is this resiliency side. So power outages, as I kind of like looked up on the web, I'm not from here, but this is just kind of what I've heard, is that if we get into a power outage and we're all in this room, how long are we going to be able to stay in this room lecturing, right? Until we're down to, not wearing much clothing because we're just way too hot, right? So that idea of resiliency can also help us if there's any kind of brownouts or blackouts and help us be able to stay in here and not have to, we can shelter in place.
Yeah, that's great. I think that we're at time.
Yeah.
So yeah, happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Awesome.
So what's your go-to U-value calculator?
A U-value calculator. Oh, that's interesting. A lot of times what we're doing is we're going right to manufacturers and sort of going through their direction as a first go-to on it. That's how I'll typically go, is go through that way, and then I'll double check that with, other manufacturers, things that are going on, what's the lab, Berkeley lab and stuff. That will kind of use a lot of that.
For the assembly, right?
Oh, for assemblies?
Yeah.
So, so our previous firm basically created a thermal bridging guide. It's probably fairly well known. It's been kind of moved around the country. That's what we'll use to do our effective U values.
Yeah, you can start putting in the assembly and basically look at a whole building, effective U value. You can look at it from assembly's perspective, or you can actually model an entire building in there, and you put in how much, lineal feet of a certain condition you have, or how much square feet of like a clear field value or roofing area, and it'll spit out a U value.
Yeah. And there's, very complex tools to be able to use that. But I think,
You have a proprietary
Well, no, it's public, it's free.
public, yeah.
And it's,
If you look up thermal bridging guide by BC Hydro,
it's thermalenvelope.ca is the website.
Yeah.
And there's a calculator on there. And that calculator is based on the equation that's in like ASHRAE 90.1 2022, where they start implementing sort of that envelope backstop and you start to account for all thermal bridges. That calculator would fulfill that requirement with that same equation.
yeah.
How do you present this information to owner groups when they hire you to evaluate a building? Do you have some sort of cost benefit analysis over a period of time, or what does that look like? And I'm sure it varies from region to region.
Yeah.
Yeah, it varies region for region. A lot of the times, we'll start with, the easy thing is, a low fee, like doing a condition assessment, because sometimes it's, on some of those buildings, like if you just looked at, the example of these, the hotel, like there's a lot of more square footage and stuff to deal with, the elevation, like the facade of the building. If this hotel was like 2 stories, but the same square footage, doing something with the roof moves that needle a lot more. So we start looking at it from, it is that project to project perspective, but that, there's an easy assessment and looking at here's some of the low hanging fruit. And we kind of put in recommendations and discussions with owner based on sort of like, here's some low cost stuff you're going to need to do anyway from a maintenance perspective in the next 5 years. Here's sort of that middle range. Here's the higher cost thing, kind of like an ASHRAE energy audit kind of thing, how you split those up.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll go from like assessment to understand what's there to solutions, as we have like a number that we just kind of like narrow down our solution list, to modeling to make sure it's going to be effective, and then costing, which then basically kind of echoes with the modeling side of it. And then we'll then try to find these sort of like synergies, this idea of like, well, if you're doing a seismic upgrade, then this, now you're into the walls, now we can kind of do, so we kind of play with that. And at the other time, we also look at life cycle costing and life cycle of materials. Because if your roof is already like 30 years old and you're probably at to replace it anyway, or you're glazing or whatever, that's a great time to do it. We talk a lot about like if your walls are only, or your glass is only 5 years old, we're like, you might as well wait, because you're just going to lose far too much of your initial investment to do it now, but you can do it later, right? So we try to do a lot of stuff with like timelining to just kind of align the different cost elements.
And each of those discussions with those owners also depends on the attitude of the owner and how long they're going to own that building, right? Sometimes we get called in and it's like, I want to flip this in 2 years. Or if it's an owner that's like, no, I'm going to own this until, we're done. It could be a campus, things like that. So those ones, they start paying attention to more of those sort of like, here's something you could phase out over 4 or 5 years perspective. But if you have these owners that just want to flip something, then it's kind of like, well, like, I don't even know why we're doing an assessment, right? Like you just like make it look nice, put a coat of paint on and walk away.
Yeah, but there is always that low hanging fruit that it's like, if might as well do some like air leakage issues or some retro commissioning from an enclosure perspective, because those are, you're in there anyway, you can play around with it, you can shift the needle a little bit, but it's all a cost issue. Anybody else for questions?
I had a quick question about the, you call them storm windows, the interiors, the glass units.
That's something that, sorry. Sasan, cool. I had a question about the interior storm glazing retrofit solution that was your case study number 1. That's something we've looked at for a couple of heritage buildings in the upper Midwest. One of the specific issues I wondered to get in the weeds on your opinion of is entrapment of moisture between the exterior and that. And there doesn't seem to be a clear solution for that, short of ventilating that cavity, which would then kind of all but eliminate the R or U factor of the exterior glazing if you're ventilating that cavity.
Agree, but yeah, and that typically is the approach. And the fact is that really what you're trying to do is you're moving your thermal line into that new high performance. So we're not really looking at interior storm to act as like an entire system together. That's very hard to do, because I think you're going to have condensation issues, you're going to have cleaning problems, you're going to have dirt. So really what we tend to do as well is we basically vent that outside and then basically look at an inside, not done doubles, triple interiors, all that kind of stuff. And so it's really, you're not looking at it as a system. The idea here is that you have to leave your original one in place because it's heritage, but we're now moving the line inside. And so when we do that, we also have to make sure that we trace the thermal side that comes inside as well. And so we've used things like nanogel blankets. They're really expensive, but if you're using it in that kind of approach, it's a really high value kind of situation too. So.
So when you mentioned the retrofit of adding cladding to exterior walls and leaving the interior insulation in place, the discussion is, where does that AVB end up?
Yep.
And do you move it if you can? And my question is, how much do you push back to actually have a hydrothermal analysis or a WUFI model of that performance of the wall?
Almost always. Yeah, so I mean, I think, you're 100% correct, is that you need to know what's in that wall. But once you start adding more insulation outside, if you add a new AVB in there, then you're pretty much in the right ballpark. Everything else inside is sort of like, in a way, ignored. But WUFI is like a great thing for doing things like that. Like, I don't do a lot of WUFI on a typical wall assembly because I'm like, I kind of know what's going to happen. But on a wall where I have lots of stuff going on, yeah, it makes sense to be able to do it, to verify it. We use therm models as well, just to sort of make sure that we understand like what's happening, from that perspective as well. We'll do exploratory openings too, because we want to make sure, like, if I'm going to put something over top of a concrete wall, I want to make sure that the anchors are good, and then I can actually, support that and do the structural calculations for it. I want to make sure that we don't have mold that's inside that wall that I need to get into and stuff like that. So that's when we do exploratory openings. I try never to open a wall until I really need to be able to do that to verify what's happening. But yeah, Woofy, absolutely. These are like all the tools that are available for you, as long as you're good at using it and you know how to interpret the results. All right, you now have the secrets, right? And this is all for you. Like, you can now go out there and do this kind of stuff. And I think that's the one thing we just ask is, as you're designing out buildings, is pay attention to that enclosure, because it really does affect it, right? It's like putting a Porsche engine inside, some of a Pinto or something like that, right? We want to make sure that this thing is well balanced, and that your owners are basically going to be super happy at the end of the day and say, okay, we've got a really great building, we've got a great MEP system now, where it's low energy, and our enclosure basically is doing its basic passive performance. So, thank you all. Yeah.